The morning of September 5, 1982, began like countless others in West Des Moines, Iowa. A quiet, suburban neighborhood still wrapped in the coolness of dawn, where the only sounds were sprinklers clicking across manicured lawns and the occasional bark of a dog. Families were still asleep, churches would not fill their pews for hours, and the streets were nearly empty. But for 12-year-old Johnny Gosch, the day had already begun. Johnny was known for his routine. Like many boys his age in the Midwest, he delivered newspapers, a responsibility that required waking long before his peers. It was a job he took seriously. He enjoyed the independence, and his parents trusted him to manage it well. That morning, Johnny rose early, collected his papers, and left his home accompanied by the family's dachshund, Gretchen. He pushed along his red wagon, the same one he always used, loaded with neatly stacked copies of the Des Moines Register. But something was different about this particular morning. Witnesses would later recall the presence of unfamiliar cars in the neighborhood. A blue Ford Fairmont and a two-toned vehicle, seen circling slowly, breaking the normal stillness of the suburban streets. Some neighbors noticed a man in one of these vehicles trying to speak to Johnny, while another sat behind the wheel, watching. These details would only surface later, after the unimaginable had already happened. Around 6 a.m., another paperboy saw Johnny speaking with a stranger. Johnny appeared uncomfortable, according to what he later told others. He reportedly muttered to a fellow delivery boy, "I don't feel safe." That small admission, chilling in hindsight, would become one of the most haunting fragments of the timeline. Johnny never returned home. When neighbors began calling the Gosch household later that morning to complain about missing newspapers, Johnny's father, John, thought perhaps his son had overslept or become distracted. But when he went to look for him, he discovered a scene that immediately struck him with dread. Just 2 blocks from the family's home, Johnny's red wagon sat abandoned on the sidewalk. Inside were stacks of undelivered newspapers. There was no sign of Johnny, no sign of Gretchen, and no indication of what had happened in those crucial moments. What stands out about this discovery is not just its suddenness, but its stillness. A wagon, untouched, holding the routine of a boy who had vanished in the middle of it. The very tool of his daily work became the silent marker of his disappearance. The Gosch family wasted no time calling police, certain that something was terribly wrong. But what followed was the first of many failures that would define this case. In 1982, law enforcement protocol often treated missing children as runaways unless clear evidence suggested otherwise. The assumption, tragically common at the time, was that a child would return on their own within a day or two. The initial responding officers treated Johnny's case with that same indifference. To the Gosch family, this was unthinkable. Johnny was not the type to wander off. He was reliable, rooted in his routine, and closely bonded to his parents. But their pleas for urgency fell on deaf ears. The police delayed organizing searches, assuming no foul play was involved. Witness statements about the suspicious cars and the strange men went largely uncollected until later, long after precious hours had slipped away. As the day wore on, the Gosches did what they could on their own. They retraced Johnny's route. They questioned neighbors. They called local friends and relatives, praying he had somehow gone off track. But every passing hour deepened the silence. Gretchen, the family dog, eventually returned home alone, without Johnny. The disappearance began to ripple through the neighborhood. Parents pulled their children closer, shaken by the idea that a boy could vanish in the middle of his morning routine. The image of the abandoned wagon spread quickly, neighbors recalling it with unease. But even as the community grew concerned, the official investigation moved slowly. This early mishandling of the case would prove devastating. Modern experts emphasize that the first 24 hours in a child abduction are the most critical for recovery. But for Johnny Gosch, that window was wasted. His parents' intuition was dismissed. The eyewitness accounts of the vehicles and the strangers weren't prioritized. And the red wagon, the silent witness left behind, was the only tangible clue the police acted upon that first day. By nightfall, the Gosches were left not with answers but with a void. Their son had vanished into the stillness of a quiet Iowa morning, and the very systems meant to protect him had failed to respond. It was the beginning of a nightmare that would not only consume their lives but also expose the gaps in America's approach to missing children. A failure that would change the country forever. You're watching Trace of Evil, where we reveal true crimes, unsolved disappearances, and mysteries surrounding crime. Like and subscribe to watch more episodes from our channel. Let's get back into the story of Johnny Gosch. The first 24 hours after a child goes missing are the most critical. But in the case of Johnny Gosch, those hours slipped away under a haze of disbelief, missteps, and bureaucratic inertia. The West Des Moines Police Department had never handled a case like this before, and their reaction revealed just how unprepared law enforcement was for the possibility of a stranger abduction. When Noreen Gosch first reported her son missing that morning, she expected urgency. She expected flashing lights, a grid search, and the community mobilized to find her boy. Instead, she was met with indifference. Police officers suggested that Johnny had run away, that maybe he was hiding out because he didn't want to finish his paper route. They pointed to his age, 12, and implied that perhaps this was a boy's attempt at rebellion. But Noreen knew her son. Johnny had not taken clothes, money, or belongings. His wagon still sat abandoned, half filled with newspapers. "My son was kidnapped," she insisted, but the words seemed to bounce off the walls of the station. At the time, there was no national protocol for handling missing children, no Amber Alert system, no immediate mobilization of resources. Police often waited 72 hours before officially declaring a child missing. In Johnny's case, those precious early hours were squandered. As the morning gave way to afternoon, neighbors began conducting their own search. Volunteers combed through streets, ditches, and wooded areas. Some recalled seeing a suspicious two-toned Ford Fairmont circling the neighborhood that morning. Others mentioned a man who had spoken to Johnny near the paper drop, asking for directions. But these details were fragmented, carried by word of mouth, and never treated as urgent leads by investigators. By evening, Noreen's frustration had hardened into fury. She and her husband, John Sr., printed flyers with Johnny's face and distributed them across town. While the police hesitated, the Gosches acted. They organized volunteers, held press conferences, and demanded answers. The story quickly caught the attention of local news outlets. A missing paperboy, vanishing in the safety of suburban Iowa, was a headline no newsroom could ignore. The pressure worked. Within days, the search for Johnny expanded beyond West Des Moines. Helicopters swept across cornfields. Divers were dispatched to rivers and ponds. Hundreds of tips poured in from across the state, each one a possible thread. But none led to Johnny. And then, a darker narrative began to unfold. Some witnesses came forward with chilling details. A neighbor reported seeing Johnny being forced into a car by two men near 42nd Street. Another claimed to have heard a boy yelling, "Help me! Let me go!" on that same morning. But inconsistencies in their statements gave police an excuse to dismiss them as unreliable. Noreen, however, believed every word. She was certain her son had been abducted by force. The police's hesitation was more than bureaucratic. It became personal. As Noreen grew louder, criticizing their failures in public, the relationship between the Gosch family and law enforcement soured. Officers accused her of hysteria, of being difficult, of undermining their work. She accused them of negligence. In the middle of this rift was a boy whose trail grew colder with each passing day. The media amplified the story, and soon, Johnny's case was no longer just local. It was national. News broadcasts carried his picture into homes across America. And with that exposure came speculation, whispers that Johnny's disappearance might not be random. Some suggested organized crime. Others spoke of trafficking rings. These were theories almost unheard of in suburban Iowa, but they clung to the case like shadows. For Noreen, the lack of answers was unbearable. She began researching child abduction cases across the country, discovering a disturbing pattern. Law enforcement's response was almost always delayed, minimizing the chances of recovery. She spoke out about the need for immediate action, for a nationwide system to treat missing children with the same urgency as kidnapped adults. Her voice grew sharper, more unyielding. If the police would not fight for Johnny, she would. As weeks turned into months, the Gosches hired private investigators. They followed tips that police had ignored. One lead took them to Oklahoma, where a child resembling Johnny had been seen with a group of men. Another came from Nebraska, where whispers of a child trafficking operation surfaced. Each lead ended in disappointment, but each also convinced Noreen that her son's disappearance was bigger than a single predator. Meanwhile, the West Des Moines police clung to the runaway theory. It was easier, less terrifying, to believe Johnny had chosen to vanish than to accept that a child could be abducted in broad daylight. Their refusal to acknowledge abduction only deepened Noreen's suspicion that something darker was at play. The case of Johnny Gosch was no longer just about one boy. It was becoming a battle between a grieving mother and an establishment unwilling to admit its failures. And in that battle, Noreen found allies. Families of other missing children reached out, sharing their own stories of indifference and delay. Together, they began to form a movement. By the end of 1982, Johnny's face was everywhere, on posters, in newspapers, and eventually on milk cartons. His disappearance became one of the first to spark a national campaign to reform how America handled missing children. What had begun as a small paper route in Iowa was now reshaping public consciousness across the country. But for Noreen, the national attention was never enough. Each interview, each flyer, each headline came with a sharp reminder. Johnny was still missing, and behind the glare of television cameras and the noise of public debate, the silence of his absence was unbearable. She would not let that silence consume her. Instead, she turned it into a weapon, her voice, her fight, her refusal to let the world forget. Because to forget Johnny Gosch was to let the darkness win. And so the battle lines were drawn. A mother's relentless pursuit of truth against a system that seemed determined to look the other way. What no one could predict was how that battle would eventually open the door to a labyrinth of conspiracy theories, accusations of government involvement, and sightings that blurred the line between fact and fiction. The disappearance of Johnny Gosch was no longer just a mystery. It was becoming a mirror, reflecting both the failings of a system and the lengths to which one family would go to uncover the truth. By the mid-1980s, Johnny Gosch's disappearance was no longer just the heartbreak of a single family. It had become the face of an emerging national crisis. His case marked one of the earliest times Americans began to confront the horrifying possibility that children could vanish without a trace, even in their own neighborhoods. The turning point came when Johnny's photograph appeared on milk cartons. It was an unprecedented idea, to place the faces of missing children where families across the country would see them every morning at the breakfast table. Johnny, alongside other missing kids, suddenly entered millions of homes, silently demanding attention with every pour of milk. The program made Johnny's name known far beyond Iowa. He was no longer just a boy on a paper route, he was a symbol. But symbols carry weight, and that weight fell most heavily on Noreen Gosch. She continued her crusade, attending rallies, testifying before lawmakers, and pressing for changes in how authorities handled missing children. Her relentless advocacy contributed to the passage of the Missing Children's Assistance Act of 1984, which established the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Johnny's face, once a local plea for help, was now part of the driving force behind systemic reform. Yet, as the public campaign grew, so did the shadows surrounding Johnny's case. For all the posters and interviews, there were still no concrete answers. The vacuum of truth created fertile ground for speculation. And speculation soon gave way to something far darker. In the years following his disappearance, whispers began to circulate about organized child trafficking networks. These were not the tales of a single predator lurking in the shadows, but allegations of well-connected groups operating with impunity. Some theories suggested links to powerful individuals in politics, law enforcement, and business. Others pointed to organized crime. For many, such claims sounded too outrageous to believe. But for Noreen, who had spent years battling silence and indifference, the idea that larger forces were at play resonated deeply. One event, in particular, fueled these suspicions. In 1997, nearly 15 years after Johnny vanished, Noreen claimed that her son, now a grown man, appeared at her door late one night. According to her account, he was accompanied by another man, and he told her he was alive but living in fear. He allegedly explained that he had been abducted by a network involved in child trafficking and that he had been groomed, abused, and eventually sold into a system too dangerous to escape. He told her he could not stay, that his life was at risk if he attempted to return permanently. And then, as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone. The claim was explosive, but unverifiable. Critics dismissed Noreen's story as desperation, the wishful delusion of a grieving mother. Others, however, believed her account wholeheartedly, pointing to the chilling consistency with rumors of trafficking rings circulating in the 1980s and 1990s. To this day, the alleged visit remains one of the most debated aspects of the Gosch case. Adding fuel to the fire were other reports of sightings. Some claimed to have seen Johnny in different states, often under the supervision of men who appeared controlling or suspicious. None of these leads ever panned out, but each added to the mystique. Was Johnny alive, hidden in plain sight, or was his memory being manipulated to serve competing narratives? The conspiracy theories surrounding Johnny's disappearance intensified in the late 1980s with the infamous Franklin scandal in Nebraska, a case involving allegations of child exploitation and high-level cover-ups. Though never directly proven to be connected, some theorists tied Johnny's disappearance to this scandal, arguing that his case was one piece of a much larger puzzle of systemic abuse and corruption. Noreen herself publicly suggested connections between Johnny's abduction and these networks, further cementing the idea that her son's disappearance was not random but orchestrated. Meanwhile, the official investigation remained stagnant. Police clung to their early skepticism and rarely entertained theories beyond the possibility of a lone abductor. To law enforcement, the case had become cold. But to Noreen, the fight was as alive as the day her son vanished. She gave interviews, wrote books, and continued to insist that Johnny's case revealed truths the public was not ready to face. Her persistence attracted both unwavering supporters and harsh critics. Some praised her as a tireless advocate who transformed personal tragedy into national reform. Others accused her of exaggeration, of allowing her grief to fuel conspiracy theories. But whether one believed her or not, one fact was undeniable. Johnny Gosch's name never faded. His story remained etched into America's cultural memory, a reminder that the safety of children was far more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. The conspiracies became part of Johnny's legacy. They transformed his disappearance from an isolated event into a haunting emblem of larger, systemic darkness. To this day, discussions of his case are rarely confined to his abduction alone. They inevitably touch on themes of corruption, trafficking, and cover-ups.